The sky above Arian was a swirling canvas of blood-red clouds and violet lightning, striking against jagged spires of rock that pierced the alien landscape. Rivers of molten energy cut through the ground, and bioluminescent plants glowed faintly in defiance of the desolation around them. A lone figure moved through the chaos, her every step resonating with power. Azara's sleek black armor shimmered with streaks of blue energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Her long, silver-white hair flowed behind her like a banner of war, and her piercing golden eyes burned with an intensity that could freeze even the fiercest warriors in their tracks. She was a myth among the living, a terror whispered in the dying breaths of her enemies. She was human, the last of her kind. The Xerthians, conquerors of countless worlds, had obliterated humanity with brutal efficiency. Planets burned, civilizations fell, and no species had survived their onslaught. Yet Azara had defied the odds, emerging from the ashes of Earth with a power no one could comprehend, and a vendetta no one could extinguish. As she approached the mouth of a vast cave, a shimmering energy field blocked her path. Strange symbols etched into the surface glowed faintly in the alien twilight. Azara raised her hand, and the markings on her armor began to emit a golden radiance. With a sudden surge of power, the barrier shattered, and she stepped inside without hesitation. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Come out, Clyrex. I know you're watching." A moment later, a shadow shifted at the back of the cave. A Xerthian emerged, his movements cautious. Unlike the towering, militarized elites of his species, Clyrex was smaller, his armor stripped of insignias, his face scarred with the marks of exile. His black, reflective eyes narrowed as he regarded her. "You shouldn't be here, human," he said, his voice guttural, his alien tongue translated perfectly through her suit. "If the generals discover you're alive, they already know," Azara interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "And I didn't come here to hide. I came to fight." Clyrex recoiled slightly, his mandibles twitching in apprehension. "Fight? Against them? Do you have a death wish?" Azara stepped closer, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "I have a purpose, and you're going to help me." The Xerthian let out a bitter laugh, his spindly arms crossing over his chest. "Help you? Do you even realize who you're speaking to? My own kind banished me. I'm a traitor to the Xerthian Empire and an enemy to everyone else. What could I possibly gain from aiding you?" Azara's expression didn't waver. Her voice dropped to a low, cutting tone. "Because you know their weakness, Clyrex, and because I know what they did to your family." At the mention of his family, Clyrex flinched. The mocking defiance in his posture faded, replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. He turned his gaze away from her, his claws curling into fists. "They have an army," he muttered after a moment. "And you're just one. No matter how powerful you think you are, you can't win this." Azara's lips curved into a cold smile. "I'm not just one. I'm the last one, and that's why they're afraid." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Clyrex stared at her, as if searching for any trace of doubt in her glowing eyes. He found none. Finally, he sighed, and gestured toward a crude holographic display carved into the wall of the cave. It flickered to life, revealing a map of Arian with glowing markers indicating Xerthian military installations. Azara stepped forward, her gaze narrowing on one specific location. "The core." "The core?" Clyrex asked, incredulous. "That's suicide. That's their heart," Azara replied. "Take me there, and I'll do the rest." For a moment, silence filled the cave. Then Clyrex gave a slow nod, his resignation evident. "If we do this, there's no turning back." Azara turned to him, her golden eyes blazing like twin suns. "I never planned on turning back, and so, an unlikely alliance was forged. The last human, driven by vengeance, and the exiled Xerthian, bound by grudges of his own. Neither could have predicted what awaited them in the core. But one thing was certain: Arian's days of submission were numbered. The landscape outside the cave was an unrelenting storm of energy and chaos. But inside, the tension between Azara and Clyrex was palpable. The map flickered in the dim light, casting shifting patterns across the rough cavern walls. Azara studied the display intently, her eyes scanning the Zerthian strongholds, supply routes, and defense perimeters. She pointed to a pulsating red mark at the center of the map. The core. What's inside? She asked without looking up. Clyrex hesitated, his claws hovering over the hologram. The core isn't just a base. It's their nexus, the heart of the Zerthian fleet's operations on Arian. Every military order, every tactical decision, every single invasion command, it all originates from there. Azara turned her head slightly, her voice calm but cutting. And you know how to get me in? Clyrex's mandibles twitched nervously. I know the layout, yes, but the defenses are impossible. Even if you manage to breach the outer shield, you'll face waves of sentinels before you even reach the inner sanctum. And then there's him. Azara's gaze sharpened. Who? Clyrex swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. General Zavor, the architect of your species' extinction. For a brief moment, Azara's expression faltered. A flicker of something, pain, rage, or perhaps a memory, crossed her features, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Her voice hardened. Good. I've been waiting to meet him. Clyrex let out a low, exasperated hiss. You're insane. You can't just walk into the core expecting to take him down. He's not just a commander. He's a legend among my people. Even in exile, I've heard the stories of his battles. Whole fleets disintegrated, planets reduced to nothing but ash. Azara moved closer, her armor humming with energy. And yet, I'm still here, which means he's not invincible. The Zerthian shook his head, muttering something in his native tongue before tapping the map to zoom in on the core's perimeter. There's only one way in that won't get you killed before you step foot inside. An underground maintenance tunnel runs beneath the primary shield generator. It's heavily guarded, but it'll bypass the main entrance. How heavily guarded? Azara asked, already calculating her next steps. Clyrex clicked his claws together, his version of a nervous sigh, heavy enough that it's suicide. Automated turrets, drone swarms, pulse mines, and if you're lucky, only a dozen sentries on patrol. Azara smirked. Sounds manageable. Clyrex stared at her, incredulous. You humans really are as reckless as the stories say. Azara's expression darkened. I'm not reckless. I'm desperate, and desperation makes you dangerous. Without another word, she turned and began checking her weapons, an energy blade sheathed at her back, twin plasma pistols holstered at her hips, and a gauntlet embedded with a glowing crystal that pulsed faintly with golden light. The crystal was her secret weapon, a relic of Earth's forgotten past, and the source of her uncanny power. Even Clyrex, with all his knowledge of Zerthian technology, couldn't explain its abilities. Are you coming, or do I have to do this alone? Azara asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. Clyrex hesitated. He was no warrior. His exile had stripped him of rank, status, and even the meager resources to defend himself. And yet, something about the way Azara carried herself, the unrelenting fire in her eyes, compelled him to follow. I'll guide you, he said reluctantly. But if we get caught, I'm blaming you. Azara smiled faintly. Fair enough. The entrance to the tunnel was hidden beneath a ridge of crystalline rock several miles from the core's surface. Clyrex led the way, his movements cautious and deliberate as he disarmed a series of traps embedded in the ground. Azara followed close behind, her senses attuned to every sound and shadow. As they approached the tunnel, the air grew colder, tinged with the acrid smell of ionized metal. The faint hum of machinery echoed from below, a reminder of the immense power coursing through the core's infrastructure. Clyrex crouched near the tunnel's entrance, pointing to a pair of automated turrets mounted on the ceiling. Those will shred us before we even make it halfway down. I can disable them, but it'll take time. You've got 2 minutes, Azara replied, drawing one of her pistols. I'll cover you. The Zerthian muttered a curse under his breath but began working on the turret's control panel, his claws moving with practiced precision. Azara stood guard, her golden eyes scanning the rocky terrain for any signs of movement. The first attack came without warning. A swarm of drones emerged from a nearby crevice, their metallic bodies reflecting the faint light of the tunnel. Azara moved instantly, her pistol firing precise, glowing blasts that tore through the drone's formations. She ducked and rolled, avoiding a volley of plasma fire as more drones joined the fray. "Clyrex!" she shouted over the chaos. "How much longer?" "Almost there," he hissed, frantically rewiring the panel. One of the drones broke through Azara's line of defense, its bladed appendages whirring as it lunged toward Clyrex. Without hesitation, Azara hurled her energy blade, the weapon slicing cleanly through the drone before embedding itself in the rock wall. "Done!" Clyrex exclaimed as the turrets powered down. "Move! Now!" Azara retrieved her blade and sprinted into the tunnel, Clyrex close on her heels. The drones pursued them, their high-pitched whines echoing through the narrow passage. Azara activated her gauntlet, releasing a burst of golden energy that disintegrated the nearest drones and sent the rest scattering. As the last remnants of the swarm fell silent, the pair stopped to catch their breath. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, its walls lined with cables and conduits pulsing with alien energy. "This is just the beginning," Clyrex muttered, his voice tinged with both fear and awe. "If the drones don't kill us, the sentries will." Azara wiped a streak of alien fluid from her armor and turned to him, her expression unwavering. "Let them come." The tunnel grew narrower as they descended deeper into the core's labyrinth, the air growing heavier with the hum of alien machinery. The walls seemed alive, pulsating with streams of energy coursing through conduits that ran like veins beneath the planet's surface. Azara led the way now, her step steady, her blade drawn and glowing faintly in the dim light. Behind her, Clyrex fidgeted, his claws clicking nervously. His eyes darted to every shadow, his paranoia growing with each passing moment. "You're too calm," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant thrum of generators. "How do you do it?" Azara didn't look back. "Fear is a luxury I can't afford." Before Clyrex could reply, a sharp mechanical hiss echoed through the tunnel ahead. Azara stopped, raising her hand to signal silence. The sound repeated, louder this time, followed by a rhythmic clanking that grew closer with each passing second. Clyrex's mandibles twitched in alarm. "Sentries," he hissed. "2, maybe 3. If they see us, we're done." Azara crouched, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the darkness. The glow of red lights emerged ahead, eyes, unblinking and cold, scanning the tunnel for intruders. Their metallic frames were monstrous, towering nearly twice Azara's height, with elongated limbs that bristled with weaponry. Their footsteps sent vibrations through the ground, each step deliberate and calculated. "They won't see us," Azara murmured, unsheathing her blade. "Stay here." "What?" Clyrex whispered harshly. "Are you insane? You can't—" But she was already moving, her body a blur as she darted into the shadows. Clyrex pressed himself against the wall, watching in disbelief as Azara slipped past the sentries, her movements impossibly quiet. The first sentry halted, its head swiveling sharply toward her position. Azara froze, her golden eyes locked on the machine as it emitted a low, droning hum. Then, with lightning speed, she leapt forward, her blade slicing cleanly through its midsection. Sparks erupted as the sentry crumpled to the ground, but the noise alerted the others. The remaining sentries turned in unison, their arm-mounted cannons charging with a high-pitched whine. Azara didn't hesitate. She lunged at the nearest one, dodging its plasma blast by mere inches. Her blade struck its leg, severing it at the joint. The sentry collapsed, firing wildly as it fell, its shots ricocheting off the tunnel walls. The third sentry opened fire, forcing Azara to retreat. She darted behind a cluster of cables, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. The sentry's targeting systems locked onto her hiding spot, and a barrage of plasma bolts scorched the air around her. Clyrex watched helplessly from his hiding place, his claws trembling. "She's going to get herself killed," he muttered to himself. Then, to his own surprise, he stepped forward. Azara noticed him immediately. "What are you doing?" she barked. Clyrex didn't answer. Instead, he tapped furiously on a small device embedded in his wrist. The sentry's head jerked toward him, distracted by the sudden interference. Its targeting systems faltered, its movements becoming erratic. "Now!" Clyrex shouted. Azara didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted toward the sentry, her blade trailing a streak of golden light. With a single, devastating strike, she drove the weapon into its core. The sentry convulsed, sparks flying from its frame before it collapsed in a heap of smoking metal. The tunnel fell silent once more, the only sound the faint crackle of damaged circuits. Azara turned to Clyrex, her expression unreadable. "I thought you said you weren't a fighter." "I'm not," he replied, his voice shaky. "But I'd rather not die down here, thank you." Azara allowed herself a faint smile. "You're not as useless as you look." Clyrex muttered something under his breath, but Azara was already moving again, her focus returning to the mission. They continued deeper into the tunnel, their path now littered with the wreckage of the sentries. Clyrex glanced at Azara, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "That blade," he said, nodding toward the glowing weapon at her side. "It's not Xerthian tech. Where did you get it?" Azara's grip on the blade tightened. "It was made on Earth." Clyrex tilted his head, intrigued. "Earth was annihilated decades ago. How could—" "I was there," Azara interrupted, her tone sharp. "I watched them destroy my world, my people. I fought in the ashes of our cities, scavenging what little we had left to survive. This blade is all that remains of the resistance. It's a reminder of what they took from us." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for once, Clyrex didn't press further. He could see the weight she carried, the fury that drove her forward. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, a new sound reached their ears, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Azara stopped, her eyes narrowing. "The shield generator," Clyrex whispered. "We're close." The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, its walls lined with conduits that fed into a towering machine at the center. The generator pulsed with energy, its blue glow illuminating the room in an otherworldly light. Dozens of Xerthian guards patrolled the area, their movements methodical and disciplined. Azara studied the scene, her mind already formulating a plan. "How do we disable it?" Clyrex pointed to a console near the base of the generator. "That terminal controls the entire system. If we overload it, the shield will collapse. But getting to it won't be easy." Azara's golden eyes glimmered with determination. "Then we make it easy." Before Clyrex could respond, she activated her gauntlet, its golden light intensifying. The battle ahead would be their most dangerous yet. But Azara was ready. She had to be. The generator chamber stretched out before them, an industrial cathedral glowing with the ominous pulse of alien energy. The air buzzed with static, a sign of the sheer power flowing through the shield generator at its center. Azara crouched behind a cluster of conduits, her gaze locked on the console Clyrex had pointed out earlier. It stood exposed at the base of the generator, surrounded by armed Xerthian guards patrolling in tight, coordinated patterns. "There are at least 20 of them," Clyrex muttered, his voice laced with dread. "And that's not counting the automated turrets. If we get caught—" "We won't," Azara interrupted, her eyes scanning the guards' movements. "We've faced worse." "You've faced worse," Clyrex corrected. "I usually survive by running, not charging into suicide missions." Azara smirked faintly, pulling her plasma pistols from their holsters. "Then stay here and watch. But if I go down, you'd better run fast or they'll tear you apart next." Before Clyrex could protest, Azara moved. She was a shadow, slipping between the flickering lights and the heavy machinery that filled the chamber. The hum of the generator masked her footsteps as she approached the first guard. With a swift motion, she activated her blade, the golden energy slicing silently through the Xerthian's armor. The guard crumpled without a sound, and Azara caught his falling weapon before it hit the floor. From his hiding spot, Clyrex watched in awe and terror as Azara moved with deadly precision. Every strike was deliberate, every motion a calculated dance of destruction. But even she couldn't take down all 20 guards on her own, not without raising the alarm. As she dispatched another patrol, Azara signaled to Clyrex, motioning toward a console near his position. He hesitated, then crept forward, his claws tapping nervously at the device's surface. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered harshly. "Shut down the turrets," Azara hissed back. "I'll handle the rest." Clyrex grumbled under his breath but began working. The console's interface was foreign, even to him, but his exiled years scavenging Xerthian tech had taught him enough to improvise. As he worked, Azara continued her assault, eliminating guards with ruthless efficiency. But she wasn't fast enough. The alarm, a sharp, metallic screech, pierced the chamber as one of the guards spotted Azara mid-strike. He raised his weapon, shouting in Xerthian. The alarm blared to life, and the room was instantly flooded with flashing red lights. So much for stealth, Clyrex muttered as he ducked behind the console, his claws flying across the controls. The guards converged on Azara, their weapons firing in unison. She moved like a whirlwind, deflecting plasma bolts with her blade and returning fire with her pistols. Each shot found its mark, but for every guard she took down, 2 more seemed to take their place. "Clyrex," she shouted, her voice strained as she dodged another volley of fire. "The turrets! Working on it," he snapped, sweat beading on his brow as he navigated the console's alien interface. "Maybe next time don't fight an army." Azara didn't respond. She was too busy staying alive. Her gauntlet flared with golden light as she unleashed a pulse of energy, blasting several guards backward. But the effort cost her. The glow of the crystal dimmed, and she stumbled briefly before regaining her footing. One of the turrets whirred to life, its barrel swiveling toward her. Azara braced herself, but before it could fire, it powered down with a sharp click. "Got it!" Clyrex shouted triumphantly. The remaining turrets went offline one by one, leaving the guards exposed. Azara pressed the advantage, charging into their ranks with her blade. The golden weapon cut through their defenses like a hot knife through ice, and within moments, the last of them fell. Breathing heavily, Azara turned to Clyrex, who peeked out cautiously from behind the console. "Now for the generator," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion creeping into her limbs. Clyrex joined her at the central console, his claws trembling as he assessed the controls. "Overloading this thing isn't as simple as flipping a switch," he muttered. "The system is tied to the core's main network. If I push it too hard, we might—" "Just do it," Azara interrupted, keeping her eyes on the entrances. She could already hear the faint echoes of reinforcements approaching. Clyrex sighed and began working, his claws a blur across the console. The generator's hum grew louder, its glow intensifying as the energy within it built to dangerous levels. Sparks flew from the machinery, and the conduits lining the walls began to crackle with raw power. "This is going to blow the whole room," Clyrex warned, his voice rising with panic. "We need to move." "Not yet," Azara said, her gaze fixed on the generator. "Wait for my signal." Clyrex stared at her in disbelief. "Your signal? Are you trying to get us killed?" The chamber trembled as the generator reached critical mass. Energy arced across the room, and the air grew suffocatingly hot. Azara tightened her grip on her blade, her eyes blazing with determination. Then she saw them. A squad of elite Xerthian soldiers stormed into the chamber, their armor glinting in the generator's light. They moved in perfect formation, their weapons trained on Azara and Clyrex. "Now!" Azara shouted. Clyrex hit the final command, and the generator erupted in a blinding explosion of light and sound. The shockwave sent the soldiers flying, their armor scorched and shattered. Azara shielded Clyrex with her body as debris rained down around them. When the light faded, the chamber was in ruins. The shield generator lay in a smoldering heap, its glow extinguished. Azara pushed herself to her feet, coughing as she surveyed the destruction. "The shield is down," Clyrex said, his voice shaky. "But every Xerthian within 100 miles probably knows we're here now." "Good," Azara replied, her tone cold and unwavering. "Let them come." She turned toward the tunnel leading deeper into the core. Their path was clear, but the hardest part of the mission was still ahead, and somewhere in the depths of the core, General Zavor was waiting. The path ahead was no longer a quiet descent into the core's depths. After the destruction of the shield generator, the tunnels vibrated with distant echoes of boots, metallic clanks, and alien battle cries. Azara and Clyrex pushed forward, navigating the maze of passages that grew narrower and more unstable the deeper they went. Azara moved with grim determination, her blade and pistols at the ready, her armor stained with scorch marks and alien fluids. Clyrex followed reluctantly, his claws scraping against the walls as his unease grew. "How much farther?" Azara asked, her voice low but urgent. Clyrex hesitated, his eyes darting to a console embedded in the wall. He tapped it quickly, its holographic display flickering to life. "We're close," he said, pointing to a pulsing red dot on the map. "The command chamber is just beyond this corridor. That's where you'll find Zavor." Azara studied the map for a brief moment before nodding. "And what about you?" Clyrex's mandibles clicked nervously. "I'll monitor the perimeter," he muttered. "Someone has to make sure no reinforcements trap us down here." Azara smirked faintly. "Suit yourself. Just don't disappear on me." Clyrex didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The ambush Azara stepped into the corridor, her senses heightened. The air here felt different, colder, heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. The walls pulsed with a faint, crimson glow, and the faint sound of machinery grew louder with each step. Then, without warning, the corridor erupted into chaos. From concealed alcoves in the walls, a squad of Xerthian elites emerged, their weapons blazing with green plasma. Azara dove to the ground, rolling behind a nearby pillar as bolts of energy scorched the air around her. Clyrex shouted from the safety of the tunnel entrance. "I knew this was a terrible idea." Azara didn't answer. She darted out from cover, her pistols firing in rapid succession. 2 of the soldiers fell, their armor pierced by the glowing projectiles. The others regrouped, their precision making it clear they were no ordinary guards. These were Xavor's personal hunters. Azara's gauntlet flared as she summoned a wave of golden energy, sending the nearest soldiers crashing into the walls, but the effort cost her. The crystal dimmed, and a sharp pain shot through her arm. "They're adapting," she muttered to herself, her mind racing. The hunters pressed their advantage, flanking her from both sides. Azara deflected a plasma blast with her blade, then countered with a devastating strike that sliced through one of her attackers. Another lunged at her, but she ducked and drove her pistol into its chest, firing point blank. Even as she fought, more hunters poured into the corridor. Clyrex, watching from his hiding spot, made a decision he immediately regretted. "Azara!" he shouted, tossing a small, cylindrical device into the fray. "Use this." Azara caught the device midair and immediately recognized it as a Xerthian EMP grenade. Without hesitation, she activated it and hurled it toward the advancing soldiers. The grenade detonated with a deafening pulse, disabling the hunters' weapons and sending them into disarray. Azara didn't waste the opportunity. She charged forward, her blade cutting through the disoriented soldiers like a hot knife through ice. Within moments, the corridor was silent once more, littered with the smoking remains of the elite squad. Azara turned to Clyrex, who peeked out cautiously. "Not bad," she admitted. "Maybe you're not as cowardly as you look." Clyrex shrugged. "I'd rather be a live coward than a dead hero." The command chamber. The final door loomed ahead, massive and imposing, engraved with intricate Xerthian runes that pulsed with an eerie light. Clyrex stopped short, his unease palpable. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Beyond this door is Zavor's command chamber." Azara approached the door, her golden eyes blazing. She placed her hand on the control panel, but the door didn't open. Instead, a voice echoed from within, deep and resonant, laced with cold amusement. "You've come far, human," the voice said, "farther than any of your kind before you. But your journey ends here." Azara's expression hardened. "Zavor." The door slid open, revealing the chamber within. It was vast, its walls lined with glowing monitors displaying tactical data, star charts, and the movements of the Xerthian fleet. At its center stood a throne-like structure, and seated upon it was General Zavor. He was massive, even by Xerthian standards, his body encased in gleaming black armor adorned with symbols of conquest. His eyes glowed a menacing red, and his mandibles curled into what could only be described as a sinister smile. "Ah, the infamous Azara," Zavr said, rising to his full height. The last of humanity. Tell me, how does it feel to carry the weight of a dead species on your shoulders? Azara stepped into the room, her blade at the ready. I didn't come here to talk, Zavr. I came to end you, Zavr chuckled. A deep, rumbling sound that reverberated through the chamber. Bold words, but words won't save you. He raised one massive arm, and the chamber's walls came alive with movement. Hidden compartments opened, releasing a swarm of drones that filled the air with their high-pitched whines. Clyrex cursed from the doorway. You have got to be kidding me. Azara's grip on her blade tightened, her golden eyes locked on Zavor. Stay back, she told Clyrex. This fight is mine. Zavor descended from his throne, his towering form casting a shadow over the room. You're brave, I'll give you that, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. But bravery without power is meaningless. Azara smirked, her gauntlet glowing brighter. Good thing I have both. And then the room erupted into chaos. The air in the command chamber was thick with energy. Charged by the hum of Zavor's drones and the blazing lights of Azara's gauntlet, the two adversaries stood motionless for a fleeting moment. A storm of tension brewing between them. Then, without warning, the room exploded into action. Azara was the first to move, lunging toward Zavor with her blade trailing a streak of golden light. The drones responded instantly, swarming toward her in a coordinated assault. She spun midair, her pistols firing in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark as drones fell in a shower of sparks. Zavor watched from his throne-like perch, his crimson eyes gleaming with amusement. Impressive, he rumbled, but predictable. He raised an arm, and the chamber itself seemed to respond. Panels in the walls shifted, revealing pulse turrets that swiveled toward Azara. They fired in unison, their emerald bolts tearing through the air. Azara ducked and weaved, the sheer force of the blast scorching the floor around her. Your tricks won't save you, she spat, her voice cutting through the chaos. She surged forward, her blade aimed directly at Zavor, but before she could strike, he extended his massive hand. A shock wave of energy radiated from his palm, slamming into Azara like a tidal wave. She flew backward, crashing into a column with a bone-jarring thud. A reluctant ally, Clyrex, still hovering near the chamber's entrance, flinched at the sound of Azara's impact. His mandibles twitched as he watched her struggle to rise. She looked vulnerable for the first time since their journey began, and the sight made something stir within him, an unwelcome sense of responsibility. Muttering curses in his native tongue, Clyrex darted toward a nearby console. His claws flew over the controls, bypassing firewalls and rerouting power. The pulse turrets hesitated, their targeting systems faltering. Clyrex grinned despite himself. Azara, he shouted. You've got a window, don't waste it. Azara shook off the pain and sprang to her feet, her golden eyes locking onto Zavor. You heard him, she growled, gripping her blade tightly. Time to end this. The dual Zavor stepped down from his throne, his movements slow but deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. You're persistent, human, he said, his voice echoing with disdain. But persistence without purpose is futile. Azara's gauntlet flared, and she charged again, her blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Zavor blocked the strike with a gauntleted hand, the impact sending a shockwave through the room. He countered with a backhanded swipe, but Azara ducked and retaliated with a blast from her gauntlet. The golden energy struck Zavor squarely in the chest, forcing him to stagger back. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Persistence isn't enough, but vengeance, that's unstoppable, Zavor roared, his voice reverberating like a thunderclap. He lunged at Azara, his fists crashing down with enough force to dent the metal floor. She leapt to the side, rolling to avoid another blow, and unleashed a flurry of plasma bolts. Most bounced harmlessly off his armor, but one found a weak point near his shoulder, eliciting a snarl of pain. You're more trouble than your species was worth, Zavor hissed. His body began to glow with a dark, crackling energy. But like them, you'll fall. The revelation. As the battle raged, Clyrex continued his work at the console. He wasn't just disabling turrets anymore. He was accessing the core's mainframe, digging deeper into its secrets. His claws hesitated as he uncovered a hidden file, an encrypted data stream labeled Project Extinction. His eyes widened as he skimmed the information. "Azara!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You need to see this. I'm a little busy," she yelled back, narrowly dodging another of Zavor's attacks. "It's about Earth," Clyrex insisted. It wasn't just an invasion. It was something more. Azara's focus faltered for a split second, enough for Zavor to capitalize. He struck her with a brutal kick, sending her skidding across the floor. She gasped for breath, her armor cracked and smoking. "Your world was a testing ground," Zavor said, his voice cold and mocking. "A proving ground for our technology. Humanity was never the target. It was just practice." Azara's eyes burned with fury as she forced herself to stand. "You're lying." "Am I?" Zavor sneered. "Ask your little friend over there." Azara glanced at Clyrex, who nodded grimly. "He's telling the truth," Clyrex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your people were collateral damage." The revelation hit Azara like a physical blow, but she refused to let it break her. "Then I'll make sure your kind never practices again," she snarled. The final strike. Zavor raised both hands, summoning a sphere of crackling dark energy that pulsed with destructive power. "You've fought well, human," he said. "But this ends now." Azara's gauntlet glowed brighter than ever, the crystal within it pulsating with golden light. She raised her blade and pistols, her voice steady and unwavering. "No," she said. "This is where it begins." Zavor hurled the energy sphere, its force ripping through the air. Azara charged headlong into the blast, her gauntlet absorbing the brunt of the energy. The golden light intensified, countering the dark sphere's power until the two forces collided in a blinding explosion. When the light faded, Zavor stood stunned. Azara emerged from the smoke, her blade glowing with the energy she had absorbed. With a final, ferocious cry, she drove the blade into Zavor's chest, piercing through his armor and into the core of his being. His roar of pain echoed through the chamber as the energy consumed him, his massive form crumbling to the ground. The room fell silent. Azara staggered back, her blade dimming as the last of Zavor's life force dissipated. She turned to Clyrex, who stood frozen by the console. "It's done," she said, her voice weary but resolute. "Let's finish this." The silence that followed Zavor's death was oppressive. The core's walls, once alive with pulsating energy, now flickered weakly, as if mourning their fallen commander. Azara stood over Zavor's lifeless form, her blade dimmed to a faint glow. Her breathing was ragged, her armor battered, but she remained upright, driven by sheer will. Clyrex broke the silence, stepping cautiously toward her. "You actually did it," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You killed him." Azara turned, her golden eyes piercing through the dim light. "It's not over yet." "What did you find?" Clyrex hesitated, then gestured toward the console. "The core isn't just a command center. It's a relay hub, connected to the Zerthian fleet across the galaxy. If we overload it, we won't just destroy this base. We'll sever their entire network. They'll lose control over their forces." Azara's eyes narrowed. "And the cost?" Clyrex's mandibles twitched. "This chamber, this planet, everything within range of the core's energy field will be obliterated." Azara nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Do it." A moment of choice. Clyrex's claws flew over the console, his expertise with Zerthian systems coming to life as he bypassed layers of encryption. Sparks flew from the machinery, and the hum of the core grew louder, more unstable. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. "You know," Clyrex said as he worked, "you might want to consider running. When this thing blows, there won't be anything left of Arion." Azara shook her head. "Not yet." She approached Zavor's throne, where a smaller, secondary console blinked faintly. Her gauntlet interfaced with it, and a holographic projection filled the air, a map of the galaxy, dotted with red marks indicating the Zerthian-controlled worlds. She scrolled through the data, her eyes scanning for something specific. Clyrex glanced over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" "We don't have time for sightseeing." "I'm not sightseeing," Azara replied. "I'm ending this." All of it. Her gauntlet pulsed, and the holographic map began to change. The red dots flickered, then disappeared one by one. Clyrex's eyes widened. You're targeting their fleet commands, he realized. You're cutting them off everywhere. Azara nodded. They'll still have ships and soldiers, but without centralized control, they'll turn on each other. The Empire will collapse. Clyrex hesitated, a strange expression crossing his face. You're more dangerous than I thought. Azara didn't respond. She finished the override and turned back to Clyrex. How long? Less than 2 minutes, he said. And we need to go. The escape. The chamber began to collapse as the core's energy spiraled out of control. Conduits burst, spewing molten energy across the floor, and the walls cracked under the pressure. Azara and Clyrex sprinted toward the exit, the path ahead shaking violently with each step. Behind them, the core's hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the air grew searingly hot. Clyrex stumbled, but Azara grabbed his arm, hauling him forward. Keep moving, she shouted. They reached the tunnel entrance just as the first explosion rocked the chamber. The shockwave threw them forward, and they tumbled into the corridor as debris rained down behind them. Azara pulled herself up, dragging Clyrex with her. We're not out yet, she said, her voice strained. The final stretch, the journey back through the tunnels, was a blur of chaos. The automated defenses were offline, but the collapsing structure posed a greater threat. Azara led the way, her blade slicing through debris that blocked their path, her strength faltering but never failing. Clyrex, despite his grumbling, kept pace, his fear overridden by the primal instinct to survive. I swear, he muttered, dodging a falling beam. If we live through this, I'm retiring to the farthest moon I can find. Azara smirked, despite the chaos. Noted. They emerged into the open air just as the core erupted behind them. A column of blinding light shot into the sky, followed by a shock wave that flattened everything in its path. Azara and Clyrex dove behind a ridge, the force of the explosion ripping through the landscape. When the dust settled, they looked back. The core was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater. The sky above Arion, once dominated by Xerthian ships, was eerily empty. Azara's override had worked. The fleet had scattered, their communication severed, their coordination shattered. The aftermath. Clyrex sat on the edge of the ridge, his shoulders slumped. You actually did it, he said quietly. You brought down the Xerthian Empire. Azara stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Not all of it, she said, but enough. Clyrex glanced at her, his mandibles twitching. So what now? You've got your vengeance. The galaxy's a little safer, but it's still a mess. Azara didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the crystal embedded in her gauntlet, its glow faint but steady. It had carried her through the impossible, but at a cost she was only beginning to comprehend. I'll keep fighting, she said finally. As long as there's something worth protecting, I'll keep fighting. Clyrex snorted. You're insane. You know that. Azara turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. You're welcome to join me. Clyrex stared at her, then shook his head with a rueful laugh. I think I've had enough heroics for a lifetime. Azara extended her hand. Good luck, Clyrex. He hesitated, then took it. Good luck, Azara. With that, they parted ways. Azara watched as Clyrex disappeared into the distance, his silhouette fading against the scorched landscape. Then she turned and began walking, her steps steady, her purpose unshaken. The last human, the invincible warrior. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the galaxy, her legend was just beginning.